They saw a girl with no shoes and no future. But when she picked up the chalk, even the professors remembered what awe felt like. There is a town in South Texas where the wind tastes like rust and the air moves slowly, like a man too tired to rise. McAllen is not the kind of place people visit on purpose. It is where the road ends, where trucks rest with tired wheels and men with tired hands. In the cotton fields, where the sun cuts without mercy, Esteban Ortega bends his back beneath 100 pounds of fiber. And waiting for him each evening is his daughter, Lucía. Lucía Ortega was 17. She owned nothing but an old backpack, a pair of quiet eyes, and a memory that remembered everything. She had no computer, no phone, no internet. What she had was paper, and a pencil someone once left behind in school, and a hunger that had nothing to do with food. Her mother, Teresa, had once studied agricultural chemistry at the University of Texas. When Lucía was still a heartbeat in her belly, Teresa left the university, unable to afford tuition or handle the weight of immigration paperwork. She never returned. But at night, under the roof of their old truck, Teresa whispered equations like lullabies. She taught Lucía the names of stars, not just their names, but their stories. "This," she said, pointing above them, "is Andromeda. It's 2 million light-years away." "And that one?" Lucía asked. "Orion, a hunter, and the belt of his robe." "And that one?" Her mother hesitated. "That one is the star I never reached." Lucía remembered that moment more clearly than any school day. Her mother's breath was heavy. The next day was a hospital visit. Then came the smell of bleach, the machines, and then silence. Teresa Ortega died of lung cancer caused by years of chemical exposure on farmland. After that, there were no more stories under the stars, only silence, and the sound of Lucía turning paper in the dark. Each evening, after working beside her father in the fields, Lucía pulled out her pages and pencil. She did not write poems. She drew diagrams, boxes with arrows, if-then statements. She wrote small programs by hand, not to impress anyone, only to understand. Her learning came from old library books no one else touched, from worksheets half lost in hallways, from whatever she could remember. Once, she tried to compress a page of numbers from her family's electric bills so she could track usage over months. She invented a pattern, a shortcut, a method. She had no idea it was related to data compression, what the world called LZ77. She was not trying to create a new method. She was trying to help her father keep the lights on. In McAllen, no one admired code. People admired grit, long shifts, and the ability to survive without complaining. Lucía kept her skills to herself. When her teacher once asked her to solve a logic puzzle, she found a different method, shorter, cleaner, and precise. The result was correct. They accused her of cheating. She said nothing. She lowered her eyes, accepted the zero, and walked home with the quiet dignity of someone who knew that truth needed no applause. Inside her backpack was a worn notebook, one that had once belonged to her mother. On the first page, in fading blue ink, Teresa had written, "Do not learn to know more. Learn to understand deeper." That summer, Esteban grew ill. His frame thinned, and his face lost color. Still, he refused to stop working. Lucía took 3 weeks off school to stay by his side. Each day she made soup the way her mother had, stirring slowly, gently, the way one closes loops in code. In the evenings, she opened a hand-crank radio. The reception was fuzzy. She turned the dial until a sharp voice cut through. "Algorithmic Innovation Challenge, hosted at MIT. now accepting entries from high school inventors. MIT. Lucía whispered the letters aloud as if they were sacred. She looked over at her father. He was asleep, one rough hand falling from under the blanket. She looked down at her own bare feet, calloused from gravel and heat. Her mother's words echoed. When no one listens, let code be your voice. The next morning, Lucía sat at the tiny table behind the truck and wrote a program. It compressed text using a pattern she'd designed herself and could later rebuild the original perfectly. She wrote the entire structure in pencil, annotated with diagrams and plain language explanations. She didn't own a scanner. She folded the papers and mailed them from the school post office. She did not expect a reply. 3 weeks later, an envelope arrived, yellow, thick, bearing the seal of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Inside was a letter. She had been invited to attend an open seminar on algorithmic design. They had accepted her submission. She ran to her father, who was sitting against the truck tire, coughing softly. He opened the letter, read it twice, then opened a rusted metal tin from beneath the floor mat. Inside was $27. Go, he said, smiling. You've been quiet long enough. Let them see how strong memory can be even when there's nothing to remember it with. Neighbors heard the news. One brought bread. One offered her old satchel. Another printed a map of the bus route north. Together, they gave her just enough for a one-way ticket to Boston. Not enough for shoes. But no one mentioned that. On the morning she left, Lucía wore her mother's handmade blouse, a pair of second-hand pants too wide at the waist, and a windbreaker she'd patched herself. Her backpack was light. No phone, no laptop. Just paper, a pencil, and one sentence from her mother playing again and again in her heart. Someday, they won't ask where you came from. They'll ask what you saw in the dark. She boarded the bus without hesitation. She did not look back. McAllen would always be there, in the soil on her soles, in the handwriting of her logic, and in the silence between lines of code. Lucía did not know what awaited her at MIT. She did not know that soon she would walk barefoot into a room filled with doubt and leave it filled with silence. She did not know that a single piece of chalk would become her voice, that a blackboard would become her horizon. All she knew as the bus pulled out of the sun-baked station was that the stars her mother once named were still above her, still watching, still waiting. The bus station in Boston was louder than Lucía had imagined. The people moved quickly, coats pulled tight, eyes never meeting. Steam hissed from the street grates. The sidewalks glistened from a recent rain. Her feet, still bare, flinched at the cold. But she did not hesitate. She clutched her notebook close and followed the printed map in her pocket, the ink already smudged from sweat and handling. She had 37 minutes before the doors of the MIT Community Library would open. It was the only place on the map she had circled in red. She did not go to find comfort. She went because that was where the internet was, and she needed to print her diagrams again. Lucía had written the code by hand, twice, once in Spanish, once in English. She had memorized every line, every loop, every annotation. But MIT would expect clarity, neatness, precision. And for that, she needed to use their machines she had only read about in books others threw away. The librarian was a tall man in a tan sweater. His badge said Mr. Ford. He did not smile at first, only watched as Lucía stepped over the threshold, damp footprints left behind on the marble floor. Her hair was tied in a fraying black ribbon. Her clothes hung too loose. Her hands trembled slightly. He asked, "Do you have a university pass?" Lucía shook her head. "I have a letter," she said quietly, holding it out. He unfolded the letter. His eyes paused on the header, the seal, the signature. "I suppose you're early," he murmured. Then he looked down. "You don't have shoes." She nodded. He looked at her face, then down at her notebook, then back at her. Without another word, he stepped aside and said, "There are old machines in the back. They don't ask questions." Lucía bowed her head. "Thank you," she said, barely above a whisper. The room was warmer than the outside. Fluorescent lights hummed above. The computers were lined like silent soldiers, glowing with standby screens. She found the one in the corner, a faded keyboard, dust in the monitor edges. Perfect. She inserted her USB drive, borrowed from the school counselor back home and wrapped in cloth like treasure. She opened her files. Her hands moved slowly, carefully formatting. The paper she would print would carry the diagrams of a compression model based on variable length prefix encoding, a concept she had never known had a name. To her, it was a better way to fold repeated information. She pressed print. A small hum from across the room. Mr. Ford, watching from the front desk, raised his head when the printer began to work. Lucía walked across the room, retrieved the warm pages, and placed them gently in her backpack, as if they were glass. "You're presenting this?" he asked as she passed his desk. "Yes," she replied. "At the open seminar. In Building 3. He nodded slowly, then said something Lucía didn't understand at first. He said, "Remember to speak like you belong here, even if they forget to listen." That afternoon, Lucía sat on the steps outside Building 3. She had memorized the location from the map. Inside, the seminar would begin at 4:30 p.m. sharp. She arrived at 3 o'clock. She liked to arrive early. It gave her time to prepare, to breathe. She opened her notebook, turned to a fresh page, and she drew. Not code this time, but the outline of a hand, her own. Then inside each finger she wrote a word. Memory, patience, silence, pattern, kindness. Her mother had once told her, "These 5 will serve you longer than talent ever will." The wind picked up. Her pages rustled. She held them tight. At exactly 4:18 p.m., the side door opened. Students in collared shirts and winter coats filed inside. They wore backpacks with names she recognized: MacBook, Lenovo, Logitech. Lucía stood. She walked behind them. No one held the door. No one looked back. But she didn't mind. The room was wide, filled with tiered seats, a whiteboard as tall as the wall. There was a low hum of voices. The first speaker, a graduate student in machine learning, presented a graph on overfitting in convolutional neural networks. The audience nodded politely. Lucía sat in the back corner, her backpack on her lap, her feet tucked beneath her. After 2 more presentations, the moderator, a thin man with glasses and a clipboard, announced a special entry. "We received an external submission from McAllen, Texas," he said. "No school affiliation listed, but the code showed creativity. Lucía Ortega?" There was silence. Heads turned. Lucía rose. She walked slowly to the front. The sound of her bare feet against the linoleum was soft but unmistakable. One student snickered. Professor Grayson, sitting in the front row, tilted his head. His fingers tapped his knee. Lucía reached the board. She said nothing. She picked up a piece of chalk, and she began to write. First, a series of inputs, then a pattern tree, then a sliding window of compression, then a loop for decompression, finally, a verification layer. She did not explain as she wrote. She drew the structure like she was drawing a face she knew by heart. It took 3 minutes. Then she set down the chalk, turned, and said simply, "This compresses any string of repeated data without loss. It requires no external dictionary, no predefined encoding table. It works with memory constraints below 1 megabyte. I wrote it for my father. He needed to track our electric bill." Silence. One of the professors leaned forward. Grayson cleared his throat. "Have you tested its failure cases?" "Yes," she replied. "It fails when it should. I built in a recursive halt if the entropy exceeds predictable range." The room was still. Grayson narrowed his eyes. "How do you know that?" Lucía paused. "Because I have seen failure, and I know how to recognize its threshold." There was a rustle of papers, a whisper, and then applause. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady, unmistakable. Lucía bowed her head, and in that moment, the professors who had dismissed her, who had looked at her feet before her face, remembered what awe felt like. Not fear, not envy, but awe. The kind that speaks when all words fail. Lucía returned to her seat. She did not smile. She simply reopened her notebook and began to write again. This time, a new page. Because when the silence fell, she knew she had said enough. Lucía did not return to McAllen right away. The MIT seminar had ended in polite applause and puzzled stares. The kind of stares people give when something doesn't fit their framework, but they're not sure if they should admit it. A few students lingered. Some whispered. Professor Grayson had left without a word, his mouth pressed into a tight line. Lucía stayed in the back corner of the lecture hall until the last light dimmed. She waited until silence reclaimed the room, until the echo of her own breath felt like company. Then she packed her notebook and pencil and walked back into the Boston night, barefoot on concrete gone cold. She had no hotel. Instead, she found her way back to the library building, Mr. Ford's building. It was closed now, lights dimmed, but she sat under the overhang, her back against the brick. She pulled the ribbon from her hair and used it to tie her notebook shut. Then she curled against her backpack and slept with the rhythm of the city as her lullaby. At dawn, she woke to footsteps. The door above her creaked. Mr. Ford stood in the frame with a coffee in one hand and a paper bag in the other. "You should come in before the sidewalk bites," he said. Lucía nodded. He handed her the bag. Inside was a warm roll and a pair of wool socks. The socks were thick, oversized, but dry. She stared at them, uncertain. "They're clean," he said. "My wife used to buy things for the donation box. I think these never made it in." Lucía put them on. The warmth stunned her. It made her throat tighten. That morning, she used one of the library's computers to write a thank you note to the seminar committee. She did not expect a reply. She only believed in completing the pattern. 2 days passed. She remained quiet. She returned to the library each morning, read academic papers, sketched diagrams on napkins. At night, she returned to the same doorstep. Mr. Ford never asked questions. He only brought coffee for 2. On the 3rd day, a letter arrived. It was not digital. It was paper. Heavy, cream-colored. The seal on the front was gold. Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Mr. Ford handed it to her without a word. Lucía took it slowly, like it might break. Inside, a single page. The language was formal but clear. "We invite Lucía Ortega to spend 1 week as a visiting observer with access to the Department of Computer Science. A workspace and advisor will be assigned. No enrollment or affiliation is required. Your work has raised interest." At the bottom, a name, Professor Thomas Grayson. Lucía read it twice. She didn't smile. She only inhaled once, deeply, and whispered, "I need a printer." That afternoon, a student assistant led her to an unused workspace on the third floor of the Stata Center. It was a glass cubicle between two labs, small but warm, a desk, a chair, a second-hand monitor, a notepad with the MIT emblem at the corner. She was told she could use it until the end of the week. Lucía placed her pencil beside the notepad. She sat. She did not log in. She just looked at the glass and saw her reflection, small, sock-footed, with two big sleeves. Then she turned to the desk and began to write. This time, not code. A question. What is the minimum amount of information a person needs to be believed? She had never asked that before, but now it stayed with her. Professor Grayson arrived at 2:30 that afternoon. He knocked once, though the door was open, and stepped in without waiting. He didn't sit. He looked at the sketches on her desk, half-finished models, alternative paths to compression, error-proofing. He frowned. "You understand what you built," he said. "But do you understand what it could be used for?" Lucía met his eyes. "No, only that it works." Grayson nodded slowly. "That's honest, but incomplete." He placed a folder on her desk. Inside were printouts, her diagrams, her presentation, an annotated version. At the bottom was a contract. "Several companies are asking questions. They want to know if you're affiliated, if the algorithm is published, if it's yours." "It is." "Then protect it, or surrender it. But choose. If you leave it unclaimed, someone else will name it." Lucía lifted the contract. Legal words, royalties, licensing, waivers. Her name misspelled twice. She said nothing. Grayson tapped the desk. "You're young. You're not ready. But you are inconvenient. That means you're real." Then he turned and left. That night, she sat in the glass room long after the labs had dimmed. She didn't cry. She didn't sign. She copied her notes again by hand, each page carefully numbered, and tied the packet with her mother's ribbon. She placed it in a shipping envelope and wrote the address to her old school in McAllen. Care of the library. For safekeeping. The next morning, she walked to the post office. It was raining. Her socks soaked through. She didn't mind. She mailed the packet, not to make a statement, but because her memory told her, truth is not owned, it is remembered. When she returned to her cubicle, a man was waiting. He wore a suit that didn't wrinkle and held a leather briefcase. His voice was smooth, his smile practiced. "Miss Ortega?" "Yes." "I'm Nathan Klein. I represent a firm interested in your compression work. May I have a moment?" She nodded. He sat. And the conversation that followed would become the first page of a different chapter, one not written in chalk or code, but in contract and conscience. But for now, Lucía listened. Because she believed the first rule of intelligence was not brilliance. It was listening long enough to know which questions mattered. Lucía sat across from Nathan Klein with her hands resting on her lap, her fingers calm and still. The man in the tailored suit sat with a kind of ease that only came from years of being listened to. He had one leg crossed neatly over the other, his briefcase set precisely by his chair. His voice was low, not unkind, but practiced, polished, like a speech given many times. "First," he said, "I want to tell you that what you've done is extraordinary." Lucía didn't answer. She listened. Nathan continued. "Our team ran a simulation of your compression model last night. We recreated the structure from the notes your professor provided. It works. And not only does it work, it's elegant, light, fast. The way early protocols used to be, before everything became bloatware. She blinked once, slowly. You don't have to say anything, he added. I'm not here to push. I'm here to propose. From the briefcase, he drew out a folder. Thick paper, crisp corners. A pen lay neatly across the top as if waiting. He placed it gently on the table between them. Lucía looked at the folder, then at him. You could license your algorithm, Nathan said. We'd give you full attribution. Name it after you. The Ortega Protocol. You'd receive upfront compensation and long-term royalties, 7 figures. She stayed quiet. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. You'd have your own team, a private lab. You'd never worry about rent, or weather, or hunger, and no more sleeping in stairwells. Lucia's jaw tightened slightly. He smiled again. You're a brilliant mind. We'd protect that mind. Let it focus. Let it grow. Lucía reached out. She touched the folder, but instead of opening it, she pushed it gently back toward him. I'm not a mind, she said. I'm a daughter. Nathan blinked. Excuse me? My mother died from chemicals used on crops. My father still picks cotton. They don't need a protocol named after me. They need code that doesn't belong to anyone, that anyone can use. Nathan adjusted his cufflink. You're young. You think open source is always the answer. But in the real world, open means vulnerable. Someone will take your code anyway. Better it be you who benefits. Lucía stood up. I already benefited, she said. I used it to help my father read his bill, and I used it to remind a room full of people that ideas don't need titles. She nodded to the folder. You can keep that. Then she turned and walked out, wool socks pressing into the polished floor. Nathan didn't call after her. He only sat back, watching the door close, and whispered not unkindly, They always come back. Eventually. Lucía returned to the third-floor cubicle, but it didn't feel the same. The room was too quiet, too bright. She gathered her pages, tied them again with the ribbon, and walked down the corridor toward the unused lecture hall from earlier that week. It was empty now, just rows of chairs and the long whiteboard still stained faintly with chalk. She stepped inside. The silence welcomed her. At the board, she picked up a new piece of chalk and began to write. Not compression algorithms this time, but a map. A structure of thought. She drew a flow of decision-making. Input, uncertainty, ethics, outcomes. She wrote, if the knowledge helps the few, then it is profit, else it is justice. She underlined the word justice 3 times. Behind her, a quiet voice spoke. Beautiful and dangerous. Lucía turned. Professor Saul Adler stood in the doorway, leaning slightly on a cane. He wore a wool coat and a scarf that looked older than the building. I was told you were somewhere on campus, he said. I saw a chalkboard through the window. Thought only one person I know writes like that. Lucía smiled faintly. Saul walked to the front row, sat carefully, and looked up at her like a student might. I heard Grayson submitted a contract on your behalf, he said. She nodded. I didn't sign it. He smiled. Good. He studied the board. Did you ever study logic formally? No. He nodded. Even better. Most students forget what it's for. Lucía leaned her chalk against the board and sat on the edge of the podium. Why are you really here? She asked him. Saul tilted his head. Because I believe in mirrors. She blinked. I had a daughter, he said. She died of leukemia when she was 16. She was sharp, kind. She thought math should be used to repair broken things. You remind me of her. Lucía lowered her gaze. She once told me that truth isn't just facts, Saul continued. It's also timing. It's when you choose to speak and when you choose to wait. I've been waiting, Lucía said, but I'm not sure for what. Saul stood again, slowly. Then let me offer something. From his coat, he pulled a single sheet of paper. It was a letter. The Clay Institute, he said. They're looking for non-traditional thinkers, people solving real-world variations of millennium problems. I showed them your model. They want to hear you speak. Lucía held the paper, reading it once. There are no conditions, Saul said. No contracts, just your voice. She looked up. I don't want to perform. You won't. You'll teach, and they'll listen. She folded the letter, tucked it into her notebook, and nodded once. Then she turned back to the board. She picked up the chalk, and she added one final line. If a child in McAllen can write this, then no one has an excuse to forget her. That evening the library was closed, but Mr. Ford had left the back door unlocked. Lucía entered quietly, made her way to the reading room, and found the table by the window, her usual spot. She took out a blank page. She wrote a letter to her father. Papi, I didn't sell the idea. I didn't lose it either. I think I carried it as far as I could on my own. Now, I will say it out loud. Maybe someone else will pick it up from there. I think that's what Mama meant by inheritance. Not money, but something you start and someone else finishes. Love, Lucía. She folded the letter, sealed it, and placed it under the ribbon holding her notebook. Then she leaned back in the chair, closed her eyes, and whispered to the silence, Let them see what McAllen sees every day. And the silence answered, not with sound, but with space, with room to keep going. It rained in Boston for 3 days straight. The kind of rain that seeped into clothes and windowsills and thoughts. Lucía stayed inside the glass cubicle on the 3rd floor of the Stata Center, surrounded by the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the far-off sound of elevator doors opening and closing. No one came to speak with her. No one called her name. She was both seen and unseen, tolerated, not welcomed. But Lucía didn't mind. She was copying her code again, this time into a small, stitched notebook she had found in a supply drawer. Each line written slowly, carefully, as though she were translating something sacred. Not just the algorithm itself, but her process, the way she had compressed meaning, preserved structure, rebuilt patterns from memory. She wrote in silence, until silence was broken. One morning, the door to her cubicle stood slightly ajar. Her notebook was gone. Not the new one, the original one. The one with the ribbon from her mother. The one that had traveled from McAllen, that held not just code, but her handwriting, her thoughts, her proof. Gone. She searched calmly at first, then frantically. She checked the trash, the corners, the hallway. She asked 2 cleaning staff, a student passing by, even the security guard near the stairwell. No one had seen it. The only thing left behind was a single pencil, hers, dulled to a nub, and a faint fingerprint on the cubicle glass. Lucía stood in the hallway, holding the pencil like a relic, and whispered, "No." She went to the front desk. Mr. Ford wasn't there. She returned to her cubicle, sat, closed her eyes, and began again. 3 days later, Professor Grayson held a lecture in the main MIT auditorium. It was scheduled as part of a faculty symposium on computational ethics. The room was full, students, professors, visiting academics, a few industry guests. Grayson stepped up to the podium in his usual charcoal coat, his notes folded neatly before him. Behind him, a projector displayed the title of his talk, Lossless Compression Under Cognitive Constraints, a Structural Approach. Lucía sat in the back. The first slide appeared. Her algorithm, her structure, her diagrams, cleaned up, digitized, but unmistakable. The compression model she had built to help her father now had a new title. The Grayson Protocol. Lucía's heart did not race. Her hands did not tremble. She simply watched. Grayson explained the algorithm's elegance, its efficiency, its potential. He outlined use cases, military communication, medical data transmission, edge computing in rural health clinics. The audience nodded. He never mentioned her name. At the end of the lecture, he was greeted with applause. Journalists took notes. A student raised their hand to ask, "What inspired this model?" Grayson replied, "Necessity. I've always believed the best code comes from scarcity." Lucía stood, quietly. She walked out of the auditorium. No one stopped her. Outside, the rain had returned. It slid down the windows like melted glass. She sat under the overhang again, her socks damp, her eyes dry. That night, she returned to the library. Mr. Ford was there. He looked up when she entered. "I lost something," she said. He nodded. "I know." She sat at the corner table. "I wrote it again," she said. "Every line. From memory." He said nothing, only placed a cup of warm tea beside her. Lucía looked at the steam rising and asked, "Does it still count as mine?" Mr. Ford thought for a long moment, then said, "You wrote it. That is one kind of ownership. He claimed it. That is another. But only one will last longer than applause." Lucía folded her hands. "I didn't want credit," she said. "Just truth." "Then write that," Mr. Ford said. So she did. On a new page, she wrote, "This is not about code. It is about who decides where knowledge lives and who it belongs to." She closed the notebook. "I need to leave," she said. He nodded. "Home?" "Yes, for now." She paused at the door. "Can you keep a copy here? Just in case?" He opened a drawer behind the desk. "Already did." The next morning, she packed her things. A student gave her a ride to the bus station. She said little. Her bag was heavier now, not from belongings, but from the weight of choice. She didn't leave with nothing. She left with silence, and with the understanding that silence, when chosen, is not weakness. She wrote a short note and left it folded under her desk in the glass room. To whoever sits here next, ask yourself, what did you come here to build? And who are you building it for? Then she stepped onto the bus. The rain followed her to the window, clinging like it did not want to say goodbye. Neither did she. But home was waiting. And sometimes, you go home not because you have lost, but because you are finally ready to give something back. Revised version. Timeline and emotional logic aligned. The bus wheezed and hissed as it pulled into the McAllen depot, its wheels coughing dust into the soft morning light. Lucía stepped off without ceremony. No one was waiting for her. No cameras, no questions. Just the Texas sun and the same cracked sidewalk that had always been there. She walked the familiar road home. Her father was in the backyard repairing a piece of old fencing. His shoulders sagged more now and his hands shook slightly when he waved, but his eyes were still clear. He didn't ask why she had come back. He only said, "I saved you your cot." Lucía set her bag down on the floor of the truck they still called home. The ribbon around her notebook had loosened in transit. She retied it carefully, then stepped outside and sat beside her father on an overturned crate. "You look thinner," he said. "You look the same." They sat like that for a while. Then Lucía said, "I want to build a room." He didn't ask what kind. He simply asked, "Where?" The old mission church at the edge of McAllen had long since fallen into silence. The roof leaked. The pews were broken. The back room had no windows and no electricity. But it had walls that stood and a door that still latched. Lucía asked the town council for access. They gave it to her with a shrug. "It's yours if you want it," someone said. "Just keep the kids safe." She cleaned it herself, swept the dust, patched the holes. She painted the walls with leftover cans from a hardware sale. White, but uneven. She didn't mind. There were no wires, no routers, no computers. So she started with paper. Each week she gathered the neighborhood children. Boys and girls, dusty from fields, shy from years of being overlooked. She gave them each a notebook and a pencil. Then she taught them to think, not just to add or subtract, but to recognize patterns, to see cause and effect, to build logic. She began with stories. "Imagine you have 2 buckets," she said. "If one is full and one is empty, and you pour from one to the other, what happens?" The children answered, laughing. She smiled. "Now imagine a program. It's just a bucket, too. It carries instructions." She drew the words on the wall in charcoal. If, then, Elsie. "This," she said, "is how you tell the world what to do." One afternoon, a boy named Diego stayed after class. He was quiet, always scribbling something in the margins of his notes. Lucía sat beside him. "What are you drawing?" she asked. He showed her a crude sketch of a robot with big ears. "He listens to everything," Diego said. "But he doesn't speak unless someone's kind to him." Lucía blinked. "What do you call him?" "Proof," Diego said. She nodded. "Then he's perfect." From that day, Diego came early and left late. He helped stack chairs, wash the chalkboard, fill the old thermos with clean water. One day, he asked, "Why do we learn this?" Lucía thought for a long time. Then she said, "Because code doesn't care where you're from. But people do. And sometimes, knowing how to speak in code is how you get them to listen." Diego didn't respond. But that night he wrote his first program. By hand. Lucía hung it on the wall beside hers. Word spread. A journalist from El Paso came to visit. Then a retired teacher from Brownsville. A box of second-hand laptops arrived. No chargers. Lucía found solar panels discarded behind a warehouse, rewired them herself, and powered the machines. Still no internet. So she built a network using USB drives, passing programs back and forth between devices. The children called it the mail cloud. Lucía laughed, but inside she felt something else. She felt that the silence had begun to speak. One evening, an envelope arrived at the church, slid under the warped front door. The return address read, Nathan Klein. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper. The handwriting was neat, sparse, and brief. "You were right. I was early, but not wrong. The door remains open, and I'm still listening. N.K." Lucía folded the letter once, then again, and placed it under a stack of worksheets. She did not answer, but she did not tear it up either. Later that week, a phone call came through the church's donated landline. The voice on the other end was slower now, older, but unmistakable. "Lucía, it's Saul." She stood quietly, hand on the receiver. "I saw the clip on local television," he said. "They showed your little robot wall. Proof, was it?" Lucía smiled. "Yes." The Clay Institute remembers you, Saul continued, and now they understand you. They don't want the algorithm. They want the story. They want the place. They want the reason behind it all. Lucía said nothing. They invited you once, Saul said gently. Now they're asking again, not as a prodigy, as a teacher. Lucía closed her eyes, then opened them. I'll come, she said, but not to present a solution. What then? To remind them that a girl with no wires still built a system, with only pencils and trust. That Sunday, the children gathered as usual. Lucía stood at the front of the room, chalk in hand. I need to go away for a little while, she said, but I will come back, and when I do, I want to see what you've built. Diego raised his hand. Can we still use your code? Lucía knelt beside him. You never needed mine, she said. You needed yours. He looked down. But I don't know if mine is good. Lucía placed her hand gently on his notebook. If it's honest, she said, it's already better than most. She stood, then added one more line to the board. If it begins in kindness, then it will last. The Clay Institute was older than Lucía had expected, not in architecture, not in furniture, but in silence. The building stood on a quiet hill outside Boston, a place of wood-paneled hallways, deep carpets, and windows that let in more sky than sound. Lucía arrived alone with a coat borrowed from the principal in McAllen, and her notebook tied again with the black ribbon that had held on since chapter 1 of her life. No red carpet, no cameras, only a woman in a navy sweater who said, "We're ready when you are." The room was small, not a stage, not a theater, just 12 chairs around a table of oak. The chair at the head was empty. Lucía sat at the far side. An older man, sharp-eyed with a clay-colored scarf, nodded and said, "We've read your structure. We've reviewed the compression tree and the recursive halt condition. What we'd like now is the rest." Lucía tilted her head. The rest? Not the code, he said. The reasons behind it. Where it came from. What made you build something that small, that fast, that honest? Lucía thought for a long time. Then she said, I didn't build it. I remembered it. They waited. My mother, she continued, used to draw constellations on the roof of our truck. She taught me that stars are just names we give to the same light. Compression, for me, was just how I folded our world into something small enough to carry. Silence. A pen tapped quietly on a notepad. Someone cleared their throat. The man leaned forward. Would you allow us to record this? Lucía paused. Why? He smiled. So others can learn from it. She nodded once, slowly. Then ask questions like you're listening, not like you're collecting. He smiled again, but this time, more gently. The next morning, an article appeared online. The barefoot mathematician who rewrote the rules of compression. Lucía hadn't spoken the word mathematician. She had said daughter. She had said girl from McAllen, but no one quoted that. Another piece followed. From Dust to Code, How Lucía Ortega Became the Voice of a Generation. She read it on a borrowed phone in a train station. The article called her a rare mind, a self-taught genius, the poster child of open-source ethics. There were photos, not taken by her, not approved by her. In one of them, she was holding Diego's notebook. The caption read, Lucía reviews a student's pseudocode at her homegrown coding school in Texas. She blinked once, closed the phone, said nothing. 2 days later, a box arrived at her father's door. Inside, brochures, posters, stickers, all branded, the Lucía framework. There was a logo, a silhouette of a girl holding a pencil like a sword. Beneath it, in clean font, teach, think, transform. Lucía stared at the design. It didn't feel wrong. It just didn't feel hers. Her father looked over her shoulder. What is that? She folded the brochure. Something someone built before asking. He raised an eyebrow. They meant well, she added. He nodded, but said nothing more. Lucía placed the box under her bed. She didn't throw it away, but she didn't open it again. Back at the mission church, the children continued to arrive. Now there were more of them. Some brought friends. Some came because they had heard of the girl who beat MIT. Some came just for the quiet. Lucía didn't change her lesson. She still used chalk, still drew buckets and arrows and if statements, still spoke slowly, like truth needed room to breathe. But she began to notice something different. They stopped asking why. They just copied. One afternoon, Diego came in late. He looked tired, a little unsure. Lucía asked, "What's wrong?" He didn't answer. After class, she found him sitting alone, tearing a page from his notebook. She sat beside him. He said, "There's this video online, some woman teaching your class, but faster." Lucía blinked. "She has a microphone," Diego continued, "and lights, and everything you say, she says it too. But not the same." Lucía gently took the page from his hand. It was a sketch of the robot again. Proof. Only now the robot looked confused. "Do you want to stop learning?" she asked. "No," he said. "I don't either," she said. And that was the end of it. That night she walked alone through the town. The desert wind moved slowly, brushing old banners and broken fences. At the gas station, she saw her own face on a magazine cover behind the counter. She didn't buy it. She didn't even read the headline. She just walked home, barefoot again, because her socks were drying and the dust felt familiar. She opened her notebook and wrote, "They've built the room, but it doesn't have my silence in it." Later that week, Saul Adler called again. "They've finalized the speaker list," he said. "You're closing the Clay conference." Lucía didn't respond. "You can say no," he added, "but if you do, they'll still talk about you, just without you." "I'm not angry," she said. "I didn't think you were. I'm just misplaced." Saul paused. "Come up here," he said. "Not to lecture, just to walk the grounds. You might remember your shape." Lucía hung up gently. She looked around the church classroom, chalk lines on the walls, children's code pinned like constellations. She whispered, "I want to remember mine." The next day, she boarded a train back to Boston. At the station, a man was waiting. Nathan Klein. He wasn't in a suit, just a shirt and old jeans. He held no briefcase, only a thermos of coffee and an envelope. Lucía stopped. "I didn't know you drank gas station coffee," she said. "Everyone has secrets," he replied. They stood in silence. Then he said, "They're naming a foundation after you." She didn't speak. "It's going to fund rural tech centers. They'll use your image, your framework. They've trademarked the name." Still silence. He handed her the envelope. "This is the only copy of the foundation brief I kept. I'm supposed to destroy it after tonight." She didn't take it. He sighed. "You don't want to stop it?" "I want it to mean something." He looked at her. Then where should it be built? She answered without pause. In a place where the first question they ask isn't how fast, but for whom. Nathan nodded. That's going to make fundraising hard. Lucía smiled softly. Truth usually does. He put the envelope down on the bench. Then he said, You're not a symbol, you know. She looked at him. No. I'm a signal. He tilted his head. I carry meaning, she said, but it only matters if someone listens. And with that, she boarded the train. She didn't look back, but Nathan did. And for the first time, he didn't see a barefoot girl. He saw a blueprint, still in pencil, still unfinished, still hers. Lucía had declined the invitation once. Back then, the Clay Institute had called her a prodigy. They wanted the code, the structure, the headline. But now, months later, they were asking differently. They had seen the dusty room in McAllen, the chalk on the wall, the robot sketch with proof written beside it. This time, they didn't want a solution. They wanted the girl who taught silence to speak. The Clay Institute auditorium was quiet when Lucía entered. Not the kind of silence that follows applause or precedes performance. It was the quiet of polished wood and velvet seats, of old minds waiting without rush. There were no banners, no slogans, just a modest placard outside. Final session, Lucía Ortega. She stepped onto the stage with no papers in hand, no slides behind her, just her ribbon-bound notebook and the shoes she had borrowed from Saul's assistant, slightly too large. The podium held a microphone. She did not use it. She stepped beside it and let her voice reach only as far as it needed. I don't have a presentation, she began. A rustle moved through the crowd, journalists shifting pens, scholars lifting brows. I don't have a chart. I don't have a framework. What I have is this. She held up the notebook. And a few questions I ask myself when I write code. Someone adjusted the soundboard. It made no difference. Lucía continued, calm and slow. Question 1. Who needs this to be true? I ask that when I compress a line of logic, because the world compresses people too, into roles, into numbers, into headlines. So I ask, who needs this to be true? My father, who couldn't read his power bill? My neighbor, who thought data was something that happened to other people? Question 2. Who will never see the code, but will still live with what it does? Most of you don't think about that. But I do. Every time I touch a line of syntax, I see my mother's lungs. I see children in fields, breathing dust instead of bandwidth. Question 3. If it works beautifully, but only for the powerful, is it still beautiful? The room had grown still. No one wrote now. No one whispered. Lucía closed her notebook and placed it gently on the floor beside her feet. I am not here to impress, she said. I'm here to remember. And to remind. Then, softer, your awards won't raise my hometown's internet speed. But if you listen carefully, truly listen, maybe your silence will. She paused, then turned to leave. A woman near the front stood suddenly and asked, Then why come at all? Lucía stopped, turned back, and said, Because a signal doesn't exist until someone hears it. She stepped down from the stage, and the entire auditorium stood, not clapping, not shouting, just standing, in stillness, listening. That night, Saul Adler found her in the garden behind the institute. She sat on an old wooden bench beneath a fig tree, her notebook unopened beside her. You could have said more, Saul said. I could have said less. He chuckled. They'll remember you. I don't need to be remembered, she said. I need the children in McAllen to not be forgotten. He sat beside her. You know, he said, I once asked my daughter what she wanted to be remembered for. She said, I want to be the pause after someone's question, before they act. Lucía nodded. I think, she whispered, that's all I've ever wanted too. The next day, Lucía declined every interview. She didn't disappear. She just became harder to reach. When a university offered her an honorary doctorate, she thanked them and suggested they use the funds to buy solar routers for migrant schools. When a company offered to host her framework, she replied, a framework written on a chalk wall doesn't belong in a box. Meanwhile, back in McAllen, the mission church kept its door open. Diego had taken her place at the front of the room. He didn't teach much, just asked questions. One day he wrote on the board, "What's the opposite of a computer?" No one answered. He smiled. Maybe it's a person who listens too slowly. The kids laughed. Then they wrote their own answers, and the room felt warm again. 3 weeks later, Lucía returned. She didn't announce it. She just walked in, placed her notebook beside Diego's, and sat among the students. He looked at her, startled. You came back. She nodded. I told you I would. He grinned. We kept your seat, but I borrowed your chalk. She smiled. Good. On the board was a new phrase. If you leave, but your question stays, then you haven't gone. Lucía read it, then took the chalk, and wrote below it, if your voice is gentle but needed, then speak anyway. The invitation came folded into cream-colored paper. It bore the seal of the Clay Institute and the signature of someone Lucía had never met. The words were graceful, the tone respectful, but the meaning was unmistakable. We would like to officially partner with you to expand your framework into a national standard curriculum. Our education and policy team will help formalize your modules. Naturally, editorial rights will be collaborative. Lucía read the letter once, then again. And then, very slowly, she placed it face down on her kitchen table. She stared at the cup of tea beside it until the steam stopped rising. Then she whispered, if they rewrite the silence, they never heard the sentence. A week later, a white SUV with government plates pulled up outside the mission church in McAllen. The man who stepped out wore a navy tie and a badge that didn't quite match his smile. He waited until Lucía finished her lesson. Then he stepped inside with careful authority. Miss Ortega, he said, you're becoming a name in rural education. She didn't reply. She wiped the chalk from her hands. We've reviewed your program. The engagement is remarkable, but we'd like to propose some improvements. More structure, clearer outcomes, reduced ambiguity. He glanced at the wall where Diego had written in childlike scrawl, what do you build when no one is watching? The man cleared his throat. Many of these questions are philosophical. We believe students need practical outcomes. Lucía nodded slowly, then walked him outside, past the yard where the children played. She pointed at a boy helping his younger sister fix a broken toy. She said, they don't need clearer outcomes. They need more trust. The man looked confused. Lucía added, you want to certify something that was never a product. He raised an eyebrow. And if we can't integrate your framework, we'll have to find one that can. Lucía met his gaze. Then you were never looking for a framework. You were looking for something you could rename. That night, Diego showed her a video. It was of her, standing at the front of the classroom, barefoot, drawing if, then, else on the board. But in the video, there was music, fast captions, cuts and edits. Her words had been turned into slogans. A channel called it the Code of the Underdog, how one girl hacked the system. Lucía watched the full 90 seconds. Then she sat down. Diego stood nervously nearby. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he said. "I just wanted people to see." Lucía looked at him, not angry, not hurt, only still. She said, "What begins in truth should never end in branding." He swallowed. She added, "You didn't steal anything, but they will." He whispered, "What do we do?" Lucía walked to the chalkboard. She wiped it clean. Not roughly, just slow, careful. She said, "We teach again, from before the noise." 3 days later, she packed her notebook, 2 shirts, and the shoes that still didn't quite fit. At sunrise, she walked past the old mission gates. No one saw her leave, not even Diego. Inside the classroom, the children found the chairs still warm. On the blackboard, a single sentence in Lucía's writing: "Teach slowly. Let them breathe." No signature, no goodbye, just that. When Diego arrived an hour later, he stood in silence. Then he picked up a piece of chalk and erased her words, not out of disrespect, but out of reverence. He wrote, carefully, "If something was given, don't hold it too tightly. Just pass it on." He didn't take Lucía's seat. He made a new one beside it. He opened her notebook, left behind on purpose, and began to copy not her answers, but her questions. The children arrived one by one, and Diego said what she had once said to him. "Let's start with a bucket, then see what it can carry." Weeks later, far from McAllen, Lucía sat in a dusty public library in a border town where no one knew her name. She wore a faded shirt. Her shoes were off again. Her notebook was open, but she hadn't written anything new. A little girl approached, curious. "Are you drawing?" Lucía looked down at the open page. A single line waited. She smiled. "Not yet." The girl sat beside her. "Can I?" Lucía turned the notebook toward her and said, "Yes, but only if you write something that someone else might need." The girl picked up the pencil, and Lucía watched. She wasn't teaching now. She was simply waiting. And that, she had learned, was the purest form of instruction. The library in McAllen had always been small. 1 room, a dozen shelves, a computer that worked only when the sun was kind to the solar panels. But it had good light in the afternoon, and that was enough. Lucía sat near the window, barefoot again. Her ribbon-bound notebook was open, but she wasn't writing, just watching. A little boy named Mateo, 7 years old, missing a front tooth, was trying to explain nested loops to his cousin using spoons. It wasn't going well, but it was going. And Lucía smiled. Behind her, a soft knock. Not on a door, but on a table. She turned. It was Diego, holding a letter. "It's from Boston," he said, "stamped by the Clay Institute." Lucía took the envelope but didn't open it. Instead, she asked, "Do you still remember proof?" Diego nodded. "I added legs. Now he walks." Lucía laughed. "Of course he does." She opened the envelope. Inside, a short note. "Dear Ms. Ortega, we wish to inform you that, after internal review, the term Grayson Protocol has been removed from all future Institute publications. While the author disputes this change, The board has chosen to list the structure as compression tree, origin, field logic, author unknown. We trust this aligns with your spirit of contribution. Respectfully, the Clay Institute. Lucía folded the letter. She didn't smile, but she breathed, and that was louder than any headline. That evening, news broke quietly. A blog post by a graduate student at MIT had gone viral. It showed a side-by-side comparison. One photo of Lucía's chalkboard in McAllen, labeled by hand, slightly uneven. One slide from Grayson's 2024 ethics lecture, identical tree, pristine font. Caption: "We call it the Grayson Protocol, but we teach it with her handwriting." Below it, a single sentence. If the structure was built by the invisible, why are we only crediting the spotlight? The comments poured in. Not anger, just recognition. And that, finally, was enough. At MIT, Professor Grayson stood alone in his office, staring at a printout of the blog post. His name had begun to vanish from conversations he once controlled. He poured tea into a chipped mug. On his desk was a folder labeled Cognitive Compression, Publication Draft. He opened it, then closed it, then turned off the lights. And for the first time in decades, didn't stay late. Back in McAllen, Lucía didn't know about the blog yet. She was sitting outside the mission church watching the sun dip behind the fence line. Children were still playing, still asking questions. Diego sat beside her. "Someone asked me if I'm going to be the next you." Lucía didn't turn her head. She just said, "Please don't." He blinked. "Why not?" She picked up a rock, turned it in her hand. "Because if all we do is replace voices, we forget to listen for new ones." He nodded, then asked, "Will you stay?" Lucía looked at him, then at the horizon. "I think," she said, "I'll always return." 1 week later, Saul Adler received a package in the mail. No return address, but he knew the handwriting. Inside, a single photograph. It showed a chalkboard in McAllen. On it, dozens of overlapping equations, drawings, loops, flowcharts, and in the corner, a child's sketch of a robot, labeled Proof. On the back of the photo, 5 words. Truth needs no final form. Saul placed it on his bookshelf, next to his daughter's journal, and whispered, "She was never yours to shape." The Clay Institute issued no further press releases, but quietly, in their internal archive, one folder was renamed Lucía Archive, Field-Originated Pedagogy, not for commercial use. It had no authorship tag, but it was protected, and that was a form of justice. Months passed. The classroom in the mission church remained open. Sometimes Lucía taught, sometimes she watched. Sometimes she simply refilled the thermos and let Diego struggle through a lesson on his own. She no longer stood at the front. She had become something quieter, something that stayed even when she left. One spring afternoon, as the peach trees near the church began to flower, a stranger came through town. Not a journalist, not an academic. A young woman, early 20s, with short hair, a backpack, and tired shoes. She asked around. Someone pointed her to the mission. She entered quietly, notebook in hand. Diego looked up from the chalkboard. "Are you here to observe?" The girl said, "No, I'm here to remember." He smiled. "Then pick a seat." She did. And on the last page of her notebook she wrote, "I came because I heard silence taught here. I stayed because the silence was kind." Lucía read that page later, after the girl had gone. She didn't know who the visitor was, But she didn't need to, because now the silence wasn't empty. It was echo. One day, in a village far from McAllen, a teacher wrote 3 words on a wall: if, then, else. When a child asked what it meant, the teacher smiled. "It means," she said, "you have a choice." The child thought for a long time, then raised her hand and whispered, "Then I choose to begin."